The dirt on her husband's grave was barely settled when the eviction notice was shoved into her trembling hands. Her ruthless in-laws took the dream house, the bank accounts, and her future. But in their blinding greed, they overlooked one rusted, forgotten piece of land, and the multi-million-dollar secret hidden inside. The Oregon rain fell in relentless, freezing sheets, mirroring the hollow numbness inside Abigail Preston's chest. She stood at the edge of the freshly dug grave, the mud seeping through the thin soles of her black shoes. At 34, she was a widow. Her husband, Benjamin, had been the vibrant, beating heart of her world until a sudden, massive aneurysm took him in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon. He was only 38. Across the open plot stood Benjamin's family. His mother, Margaret, and his older brother, Gregory. They huddled under a massive golf umbrella, their faces set in masks of polite, practiced sorrow. Margaret, wrapped in a tailored wool coat that cost more than Abigail's first car, didn't shed a single tear. Gregory spent the entire service checking his vibrating phone, his jaw tight with poorly concealed impatience. Abigail had never been welcomed into the Preston family. To Margaret, Abigail was the former diner waitress who had trapped her youngest son, a gold digger who had tarnished the prestigious family lineage. Benjamin had spent his life shielding his wife from their venom, but with him gone, the shield was brutally shattered. After the funeral, Abigail returned alone to the sprawling, cedar-wrapped estate she and Benjamin had shared for 5 years. The house sat on a beautiful 40-acre stretch of forested land on the outskirts of Eugene. It was their sanctuary, filled with Benjamin's eclectic collections. He had made a lucrative living as a high-end liquidator and restorer of rare industrial antiques, traveling the country to salvage history from abandoned factories and forgotten estates. Exhausted to her very marrow, Abigail curled into Benjamin's favorite leather armchair, clutching one of his unwashed flannel shirts to her face just to breathe in the fading scent of cedar and motor oil. She fell into a fitful, nightmare-plagued sleep. She was violently awakened the next morning by the sound of keys turning in the heavy oak front door. It was 8 a.m. Standing in the foyer, wiping their wet designer shoes on the Persian rug, were Margaret and Gregory. Behind them stood a man in a cheap grey suit, clutching a leather briefcase. "Margaret?" "Gregory," Abigail croaked, her throat raw from weeping. "What are you doing here?" Margaret stepped forward, her eyes scanning the living room as if appraising the furniture for auction. "We are here to secure the property, Abigail. I suggest you start packing." Abigail blinked, her sleep-addled brain struggling to process the words. "Secure the property? This is my home. Ben's and mine." Gregory let out a sharp, cruel laugh. He walked past her, running a finger over a dusty antique mantelpiece. "Actually, Abby, it's not. It never was." The man in the suit stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Mrs. Preston, I am Harrison Gable, counsel for the Preston Family Trust. I'm afraid Gregory is correct. This estate, including the surrounding 37 acres, was purchased by the trust before your marriage to Benjamin. It was a condition of his inheritance that the deed remain in the trust's name. Ben told me he was transferring the deed," Abigail said, panic finally piercing through her grief. "He told me he had the paperwork drafted last year. We were building a life here." "Intent is not legally binding, Abigail," Margaret said coldly, her voice dripping with disdain. "Benjamin was a naive boy who made foolish promises. The deed was never altered. Upon his passing, control of this property reverted entirely to me as the primary trustee. You have no legal claim to this house, the land, or the trust accounts." Abigail's legs gave out. She slumped back into the armchair, staring at the three of them in horror. Ben has been dead for 4 days. We just buried him yesterday. You can't do this. We can, and we are, Gregory smirked, crossing his arms. Mother is putting the estate on the market immediately. We have a developer flying in from Seattle this afternoon. You have 2 hours to gather your personal effects. Clothes and toiletries only. Everything else in this house, the antiques, the vehicles, the furniture, belongs to the trust. Please, Abigail begged, the tears spilling over. I have nowhere to go. My name isn't on the joint savings account because we were restructuring our finances. I have a few $100s in my checking account. Please, Margaret. Ben would hate this. Margaret's face hardened into a mask of pure ice. Do not presume to tell me what my son would want. You were a temporary distraction, a mistake. Your time living off the Preston name is over. 2 hours, Abigail, or I will have the sheriff remove you for trespassing. For the next 120 minutes, Abigail moved like a ghost. She threw her clothes into garbage bags and a worn suitcase. She was heavily monitored by Gregory, who watched her every move to ensure she didn't take any of Benjamin's expensive watches or antique collections. She was allowed to take her Subaru, which was solely in her name, but nothing else. As she backed out of the long, gravel driveway, Abigail watched Margaret and Gregory standing on the porch of her dream home, already pointing out landscaping changes to each other. They had erased her. Just like that, the life she had built was gone. Stolen by a family whose greed knew absolutely no bounds. Abigail spent the next 2 weeks living in a squalid, damp motel off the interstate. The neon sign outside her window flickered relentlessly, casting a sickly red glow over the cheap veneer desk where she sat every night, poring over the few boxes of personal files she had managed to smuggle out in the trunk of her car. She had hired a pro bono legal aid attorney named Nelson to review the trust documents she had found in Ben's old Home Office files. Nelson had confirmed the devastating truth. Margaret's lawyer wasn't lying. The Preston Family Trust was an ironclad, blood-relative-only legal fortress. Ben, in his chronic procrastination and misplaced faith in his family's decency, had never formalized the transfer of the house to Abigail. She was utterly destitute. But on the 15th night in the motel, fueled by bad coffee and sheer desperation, Abigail found something buried at the bottom of a box of old tax returns. It was a manila envelope, water-stained and smelling of mildew. Inside was a property deed dated 3 years prior. Abigail traced her fingers over the heavy, embossed paper, her eyes widening. The deed was not in the name of the Preston Family Trust. It was in the name of Abigail Mary Preston. She scrambled for her phone, calling Nelson and leaving a frantic voicemail at 2 a.m. When they met at Nelson's cramped office the next morning, the lawyer adjusted his glasses, reading over the document carefully. This is interesting," Nelson muttered, comparing the deed to the county plat maps on his computer screen. "Is it real?" Abigail asked, holding her breath. "Of course, it's real, and it's legally flawless," Nelson replied, looking up with a confused smile. "Do you remember a few years ago, when your neighbor to the south, old Mr. Henderson, passed away?" "Yes," Abigail nodded. "His kids sold off his farm. Ben bought a tiny sliver of it because it bumped right up against our property line. It was just a weird 3-acre wedge of dirt with a massive, rusted Quonset hut on it." Nelson tapped the paper. "Exactly. Benjamin didn't use trust money to buy it. He used a separate personal LLC, and then he transferred the deed entirely into your name. According to the county records, those 3 acres, and whatever sits on them, belong exclusively to you. The Prestons don't own it. The trust doesn't own it. It wasn't part of the original estate. Abigail slumped back in her chair. A bittersweet memory washed over her. It was their 2nd anniversary. Ben had handed her a ridiculous, oversized novelty key. "Happy anniversary, babe," he had laughed. "I bought you the ugly tin can next door. You said you wanted a secluded art studio. It needs a little work, but the land is yours." She had never used it. The Quonset hut, a massive, half-cylinder corrugated steel structure from the 1950s, was an eyesore. It was overgrown with blackberry brambles, completely off the grid, and rusted shut. Ben had eventually used it for overflow storage, dragging heavy equipment and God knows what behind its padlocked steel doors. Abigail had never even stepped foot inside. "It's just a rusted metal shed," Abigail sighed, rubbing her temples. "It's practically worthless. The land might be worth a few $1,000s if I sell it, but it's landlocked by Margaret's property now." "There is an established easement," Nelson pointed out, tapping a line on the map. "A dirt access road that skirts the edge of the Preston estate. By law, Margaret cannot block your access to your property. If I were you, I'd go see what your husband left you. At the very least, you can liquidate the scrap metal." The following afternoon, Abigail drove her Subaru down the muddy, rutted utility road that bordered the Preston estate. The rain had stopped, leaving a heavy grey mist hanging in the pine trees. As she approached the 3-acre parcel, she saw Gregory's black Range Rover parked aggressively across the dirt path, blocking her way. Gregory was leaning against the hood, smoking a cigar, looking intensely irritated. Margaret had obviously been notified by the county clerk about Abigail's legal inquiry into the parcel. Abigail stepped out of her car, the cold air biting her cheeks. "Well, well," Gregory sneered, tossing his cigar into the wet grass. "Look who crawled out of the gutter. My mother's lawyers told us about your little loophole. 3 acres of swamp and a tetanus hazard." "Move your car, Gregory," Abigail said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You're blocking an active easement." Gregory laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're pathetic, Abby. You think you've won something? Mother just signed the paperwork with the Seattle developer this morning. They are bulldozing the entire 40 acres to build luxury cabins. We offered them your little 3-acre junk pile, but they didn't even want it. It's a toxic dump. But if you want to play in the mud, be my guest." He slowly got into his SUV, rolling down the window as he reversed out of her way. "Enjoy your rust, sweetheart. Don't freeze to death out here." Abigail watched him drive away, her jaw clenched so tight her teeth ached. She got back in her car and drove the remaining 100 yards, parking in front of the massive, overgrown Quonset hut. It looked exactly as she remembered, only more derelict. The corrugated steel was a patchwork of brown rust and peeling silver paint. Blackberry vines the thickness of ropes had crawled up the sides, trying to swallow the structure whole. She walked up to the heavy, sliding metal doors. A massive, heavy-duty master lock secured a thick steel chain wrapped around the handles. Abigail pulled a heavy crowbar and a pair of bolt cutters from her trunk. It took her 30 minutes of exhausting, muscle-tearing effort to snap the rusted padlock. It fell to the mud with a heavy thud. Grabbing the handles, she threw her entire body weight backward. With a horrific screech of metal on metal, the heavy doors rolled open, kicking up a cloud of stale, dry dust. Abigail coughed, waving her hands in front of her face as the dim afternoon light pierced the gloom of the massive interior. The air inside smelled of machine oil, old canvas, and dry earth. She pulled out her heavy-duty flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the cavernous space. At first her heart sank. The hut was packed to the ceiling with absolute junk. Stacks of rotting wooden pallets, rusted engine blocks, mountains of old tires, and heavy mildewed tarps covering what looked like broken industrial machinery. It was exactly what Gregory had said. A dumping ground. Tears of frustration pricked her eyes. She had hoped desperately that Ben had hidden away a classic car or some high-value antiques she could sell to get back on her feet. Instead, she had inherited a hoarder's paradise. But as Abigail walked deeper into the hut, her flashlight beam caught something strange. The dust on the floor near the entrance was inches thick, undisturbed for years. But toward the back of the massive shed, behind a wall of stacked pallets, the dust had been swept clean. She squeezed through a narrow gap between a rusted tractor and a stack of oil drums, making her way to the back wall. Here, hidden entirely from the front entrance, was a heavily insulated, climate-controlled shipping container modified into a stand-alone room within the Quonset hut. A heavy digital keypad secured the steel door. Abigail's breath hitched. She approached the keypad. It was blinking a faint, battery-powered red light. Ben was a creature of habit. If he had a code, it was always the same. With trembling fingers, she typed in their wedding date. 091418. The light flashed green. A heavy bolt clicked open. Abigail grabbed the handle and pulled the door wide. What she saw inside made her drop her flashlight onto the metal floor, the beam rolling wildly to illuminate a secret that would bring the Preston family to its knees. The heavy steel door swung outward, revealing a space that defied all logic. Abigail picked up her flashlight, but she didn't need it. Motion sensors triggered a grid of harsh, brilliant white LED panels that flooded the modified shipping container with pristine, museum-quality illumination. The air inside was completely different from the rotting, damp Quonset hut. It was crisp, meticulously climate-controlled, and smelled faintly of expensive leather and polished brass. Abigail stepped over the threshold, her breath catching in her throat as she stared at the sprawling interior. The container had been expanded, retrofitted into a subterranean-style vault, and it was filled with absolute treasures. Sitting in the dead center, resting on a spotless gray epoxy floor, was a breathtaking vintage automobile. Abigail recognized it from one of Ben's old auction catalogs. A flawless, midnight blue, 1937 Bugatti Type 57S Atalante. Its chrome gleamed under the overhead lights, entirely untouched by dust. To its left sat a pristine, fully restored 1936 Crocker small tank motorcycle, a machine so rare that collectors frequently engaged in bidding wars reaching millions just for a rusted frame. But the vehicles were only the beginning. Lining the insulated walls were heavy steel workbenches and locked glass display cases. Abigail walked slowly down the aisle, feeling as though she had crossed into an alternate dimension. One case held a row of antique, highly complicated Patek Philippe pocket watches from the late 19th century. Another held a meticulously preserved Enigma machine from World War II, its wooden box and brass rotors polished to perfection. There were rows of authenticated Nikola Tesla handwritten laboratory journals, sealed in argon-filled acrylic cases to prevent decay. At the very back of the vault, sitting on a sturdy oak desk, was a heavy iron safe. Next to it rested a simple leather-bound journal and a crisp, white envelope with her name written across the front in Ben's familiar, slanted handwriting. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the envelope. She broke the wax seal, unfolding the thick parchment paper. My dearest Abby, if you are reading this, it means my heart finally gave out, and I am no longer there to protect you. It also means my mother and brother have likely done exactly what I always feared they would do: cut you out and thrown you to the wolves. I never told you the full truth about the Preston Family Trust. When my grandfather established it, he drafted a ruthless clause. Any property held by the trust could never be transferred to a spouse who did not carry Preston blood, and the primary trustee, my mother, held absolute veto power over any financial disbursements upon my death. If I had tried to fight her in court while I was alive, she would have locked our lives up in endless, miserable litigation. She would have drained us dry just to prove a point. So I decided to play her game, but by my own rules. Over the last 5 years, I funneled the vast majority of my highest value liquidations entirely off the books. When I restored a multi-million-dollar artifact or vehicle, I reported a fraction of the commission to the trust's accountants and took the rest in untraceable, hard assets. I legally purchased the 3-acre wedge of dirt next door through a dummy LLC, put the deed solely in your name, and built this vault. Everything in this room belongs to you, Abby. The Bugatti alone was appraised by R.M. Sotheby's at $9 million. The Crocker motorcycle is worth at least 1.5. The safe on this desk contains 50 pounds of certified gold bullion and a velvet pouch filled with uncut Montana Yogo sapphires I accepted as payment from a private estate in Bozeman. In total, you are standing in a room worth over $20 million. My family thinks they won. They think they took your home. But this is your true home, Abby. This is your freedom. Sell it all. Take the money, leave Oregon, and build a beautiful life. I am so deeply sorry I couldn't be there to live it with you. I love you. Forever yours, Ben. Abigail sank to the cold epoxy floor, clutching the letter to her chest as a guttural, agonizing sob tore from her throat. She cried for the man who had loved her enough to build an invisible empire just to keep her safe. She cried for the sheer, overwhelming relief of knowing that she was no longer at the mercy of Margaret Preston's cruelty. When the tears finally stopped, a new emotion began to take root in Abigail's chest. It was cold, sharp, and intensely focused. It was absolute, unadulterated vengeance. She stood up, wiping her face, and walked over to the heavy iron safe. She didn't need the combination. She typed in their wedding date, and the heavy door swung open. The dull, heavy gleam of stacked gold bars stared back at her. Abigail pulled out her cell phone. The steel walls of the vault blocked her signal, so she walked back out into the cavernous, rusting shell of the Quonset hut. The cold Oregon air hit her face, but she no longer felt the chill. She dialed Nelson's number. "Nelson," she said, her voice dropping an octave, steady and commanding. "I need you to contact the senior appraisal director at R.M. Sotheby's immediately, and then I need you to hire the most ruthless private security firm in Eugene. We have work to do." 2 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the Preston estate was suffocatingly tense. Margaret paced the length of the grand living room, her expensive heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. Gregory sat on the plush velvet sofa, nervously swirling a glass of scotch. Across from them sat Mitchell Gallagher, the ruthless Seattle developer they had partnered with, and his team of corporate lawyers. "Explain to me how this happened," Margaret demanded, glaring at Gallagher. "We signed the contracts. We agreed on a $14 million buyout for the 40 acres. The bulldozers were supposed to break ground yesterday." Gallagher sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Margaret, My engineers finalized the topographical surveys last week. To build the luxury cabin subdivision, we have to lay a high-capacity commercial sewer main. Because of the protected wetlands on the eastern edge of your property, the county zoning board mandates that the main sewer line must exit through the southern corridor. So build it through the southern corridor, Gregory snapped. We can't, Gallagher replied, his voice hardening. The southern corridor is blocked by a 3-acre wedge of land that you do not own. It belongs to Abigail Preston. We ran the county records. Her parcel completely landlocks the only viable excavation route. Without a granted easement from her, the city will not issue a single building permit. The entire project is dead in the water unless she signs over access. Margaret's face drained of color. That wretched girl. She owns a toxic scrap heap. Just buy it from her. Offer her $50,000. She's living in a motel, she'll take anything. I tried, Gallagher said flatly. I sent my lawyers to her attorney offering $500,000. They rejected it without a counteroffer. She refuses to grant the easement, and she refuses to sell. Gregory slammed his glass onto the coffee table. I'll handle this. I'll go down to that rusted tin can right now and force her to sign. You won't have to go far, Gregory. A calm, chilling voice echoed from the foyer. Margaret and Gregory whipped around. Standing in the arched doorway of the living room was Abigail. She was no longer the broken, weeping widow they had thrown out into the rain. Abigail wore a sharply tailored, charcoal grey Armani suit. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, professional knot, and her posture radiated an aura of terrifying, unshakable power. Flanking her were 2 massive, stone-faced private security contractors in dark suits, and Nelson, clutching a thick leather portfolio. "How did you get in here?" Margaret hissed, her hands trembling with rage. "You are trespassing." "I walked through the front door, Margaret," Abigail replied smoothly, stepping into the living room. "The locks haven't been changed yet. A sloppy oversight on your part." Gregory stood up, puffing out his chest. "Listen to me, you gold-digging parasite. I don't know what game you think you're playing, but you are going to sign that easement right now, or I will bury you in legal fees until you are living on the street." Abigail let out a soft, melodic laugh that chilled the room. "You can't afford to bury me, Gregory, but I can certainly afford to bury you." She gestured to Nelson, who stepped forward and handed copies of a sleek, heavy document to Margaret, Gregory, and Gallagher. "What is this?" Margaret demanded, refusing to touch the paper. "That is a finalized bill of sale and transfer of funds," Abigail said, walking over to the fireplace and running a finger along the mantel she used to clean. "Last week, R.M. Sotheby's brokered a private off-market acquisition. A collector in Dubai purchased a 1937 Bugatti-type 57S Atalante, a 1936 Crocker motorcycle, and several other highly significant historical artifacts. Those items were legally housed on my property, under my LLC." Gregory's eyes frantically scanned the document, his jaw dropping as he saw the final figures. $22 million, he whispered, his face turning entirely pale. Where did you get these?" "Ben," Abigail said, her eyes flashing with triumphant fire. "He knew exactly what you were, Margaret. He knew you would steal this house the moment he was gone. So he spent 5 years liquidating his best finds and hiding the cash in hard assets on the one piece of land you couldn't touch. He left me everything. You got the house, but I got the empire." Margaret swayed on her feet, clutching the back of an armchair for support. That is trust property. You stole from this family. I will have you arrested." The paper trail is flawless, Mrs. Preston, Nelson interjected calmly. Benjamin used his personal commissions, legally separated from the trust, to purchase the assets. The LLC is ironclad. If you attempt to sue, we will countersue for harassment, and you will lose. Abigail turned to Mitchell Gallagher, who was watching the scene with wide, shocked eyes. Mr. Gallagher, I am officially denying your request for an easement across my property. I will never allow a sewer line, a bulldozer, or a single piece of construction equipment to cross my 3 acres. Your luxury cabin project is dead. Gallagher stood up, furious. Margaret, you promised me clear title and zoning access. I have already sunk $2 million into surveying and architectural fees. If this project dies, my firm is suing the Preston Family Trust for breach of contract and damages. Mitchell, please, Margaret begged, panic finally shattering her icy exterior. We can fix this. Abigail, be reasonable. I will give you the house back. Just sign the easement. Abigail stopped at the doorway, looking back at the woman who had tormented her for years, and the brother-in-law who had thrown her out in the freezing rain. I don't want the house, Margaret, Abigail said quietly, her voice ringing with absolute finality. It's tainted by your greed. Keep the cedar wood. Keep the property. I hope you enjoy the view of my rusted Quonset hut for the rest of your miserable, bankrupt life. Abigail turned and walked out the front door, the heavy oak clicking shut behind her. Within 6 months, the Preston Family Trust collapsed under the weight of Gallagher's massive breach of contract lawsuit. Forced to liquidate their assets to pay the catastrophic legal penalties, Margaret and Gregory had to sell the estate to a corporate holding company at a devastating loss. They relocated to a small, cramped apartment in a dismal suburb, entirely stripped of the prestige and wealth they had valued above all else. As for Abigail, she didn't stay in Oregon. She hired a crew to dismantle the climate-controlled vault, sold the 3-acre parcel for pennies just to be rid of it, and moved to the sun-drenched coast of California. She bought a beautiful, sprawling home overlooking the Pacific Ocean, entirely in her own name. She filled it with art, light, and the quiet, enduring memory of a husband whose love had reached far beyond the grave to give her the ultimate victory. Thank you so much for reading this incredible story of betrayal, hidden wealth, and ultimate justice. If Abigail's brilliant revenge and Benjamin's master plan kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this thrilling story with your friends and family who love a good plot twist, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life dramas every single week.